So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of the bigger picture climate change aspect of this. We talked about this a little earlier, a couple of weeks ago. So these are the kind of changes that we expect to see in Edmonton in terms of the climate. So hotter summers, longer summers, less soil moisture in the summertime, and winter, less snow, less cold days and less snow. And kind of what that really means in terms of energy, it really means more air conditioning, which equals more electricity use. And in the winter, it means less space heating, which means less natural gas use. And the drier soil presumably means that agriculture and all the industries that rely on the rain and rely on the moisture in the soil will now have to create that using water pumps or artificial means, again, using electricity, using energy in order to make those happen. So based on this slide, you can really see that what we can expect is just an increase of electricity use and a decrease of natural gas use. But one thing that is actually not supposed to change is how there's supposed to be very little change in how much sunshine Edmonton gets. So the amount of sunshiny days is relatively going to stay the same, which is actually a perfect thing for solar. It's just one of, I'm sure all of you know the benefits of solar. Being in this room, you probably know a little bit about it anyways, but solar has a lot of benefits, including, increased employment, local employment, save money, save energy, and as well as less air pollution, less coal mining, which affects both the population and the environment. But these green factors, these sustainability things, are not always motivators for everyone. And while I was researching this, I came across an article about why people get solar. They asked a whole bunch of people who had solar why they got it. And one of the big things was that sustainability wasn't always the reason. In fact, in some cases, it was actually a deterrent to people getting solar because being sustainable or being green was still seen as a niche. And if niche technology, by definition, is kind of clustered and may not be as developed as it possibly could, which is not true, but that's how it's viewed. One of the other things the study actually came out with was that without context, that payback number, the quick, easy numbers can be misunderstood or can act as a deterrent because they're not in context, because they're not understood. And also, social networking is super, super important in order to share messages and understand what it's about. The reason I kind of brought this one up is mostly because it's interesting, but also because that social networking piece is really caught my eye, because to me, that's what community leagues are. So community leagues can act as that social network for people to gain knowledge and disseminate information about solar, whether they participate in putting the solar on the building or not. So it provides an opportunity for people to, risk-free or commitment-free experience the experience of solar, getting solar, as well as seeing how it works and how it all puts together without having to commit their home to that. As well, it's also pretty visible. So in doing so, it kind of affects the community outwards, whereas a single home doesn't have that same community building, community networking aspect to it. So that's kind of why I view solar as important, on a community level, for doing it on a community level as opposed to a individual home level. But as we've talked about before, that's not always the best seller. So I tried to include. I'm always going to try to include these slides. Is how do you then sell it to the naysayer? How do you say it? And the biggest ones that I've seen is, first one is save money. That's one that comes up time and time again for the people whose sustainability is not reason enough. And there is an upfront cost to solar, but there's also lots of incentives, and how to combat that is that, there's lots of incentives. There's tons of money out there right now to work towards getting it and reducing that big upfront cost. They also have a very long life. Solar panels generally last around 25 years warranty, but up to a lot longer than that, which means that the benefits will be felt for a long time. Any benefits you feel from solar will continue on into the future. So if because it reduces operating costs, maybe someone will be able to carry on their favorite programming, their favorite soccer, their favorite skating rink, or whatever those costs may be directed towards. Another thing that I always find really interesting is that, as we saw on the earlier slide, the prices of electricity are probably going to go up based on the increased demand for it, based on climate change science. In which case, solar acts as a little bit of a buffer. So it reduces the amount of electricity that you need to take in from the grid, therefore reducing how much money you're taking in. The second really big thing, kind of how to sell it to your board members, is branding. It's selling your community. It's who are you as a community, and adds to that. So one thing that it does is it attracts volunteers and people who are interested in solar. So people see it's a very visible thing. So they see solar on a building, which then may entice them to join their community leagues or get involved and be in their community as well. It also entices renters. We talked about it earlier, the carbon neutral weddings. So if you have a building which is carbon neutral, you now have an opportunity to market that to those who want to get married in a carbon neutral setting, bringing people from not only the community but from all over the city. And finally, which is what these pictures are of, you have an opportunity to be a part of events and networking and events that go on around sustainability. So the individual community leagues have held solar themed events, such as Queen Alexandra held a solar fun days. Evansdale did something similar. They were also, Evansdale was actually a part of the solar home tour. So a bunch of interested people who have solar on their homes, they also offered up their community league for a tour of that, increasing interest in their building as well. And actually the top picture is from the Green League's launch party, where the Minister of the Environment and Parks and the Environment, came, and that was at Evansdale too, based on their large solar array. So those are all things that can add to why solar is interesting. Not just because it saves it could be just because it saves operating costs. It could just be because it's a way to brand your community. However, if sustainability isn't really the definition of your community, that's not really what the community wants to be known for. It could also, by reducing operating costs, it could then help you become the greatest soccer team, or the best, most variety of programming, or whatever it is that your brand, your community's brand, would like to be. So that kind of is how you could potentially sell it to someone who the environmental stuff isn't quite there. So that's kind of my spiel, and I just wanted to pass it over to Warren to talk a little bit about how you do it now.
So my name is Warren Sarauer. I'm the chair of the board, as Charlotte mentioned, an organization known as SPICE, which is a solar power investment co-op of Edmonton. Member-owned co-op. We're just getting ready to launch some projects this year, do some membership drive and everything, and the province is working on what they call a community energy program, and so we're hoping to do some community-wide programs. And we've been working on this for several years, actually. We're about 4 or 5 years into this already. I was the chair of the board for the Solar Energy Society when the first round of programs was done. It wasn't called the Green Leagues at that time, but it was a series of demonstration solar and energy efficiency assessments and upgrades. And it was done in around 2012, 2013. And I own my own solar company. And through that company, we've also done about 7 systems on community leagues. And for the people in the Highlands, we did the system on Brian Mason's constituency office. That was one of our projects as well. I also happen to own a building in Beacon Heights, which is just a little east of you guys and north as well. And it was a neighborhood convenience store that we retrofitted to a net zero energy building. And it has a fairly prominent solar array on it. And it has 3 tenants in there. There's 2 offices and a residence. And we provide electricity for the entire site, and for the office, all of the energy. So that heat, hot water, and all the electricity that we use. And that building is about 60 years old, and we retrofitted it in 2010. And at the time, it was one of the very few retrofit commercial net zeros in Canada. So of course in Alberta here we're used to looking below the ground for our energy, but there's lots of it above the ground too, and that's what we're here today to talk about. This is a list of all the solar, either assessments, solar systems that are installed, or solar systems that are being considered this year from all the leagues. And so there's quite a list here, and it's hard to kind of tell exactly which phase some of them are in. So it basically started around 2013, and so this is really over the last 4 years, so it's really starting to pick up now. The funding is much more mature at the moment, and there's only really 2 systems in this list that are doing 100% offset of their consumption. It's Evansdale, which is quite large. We installed both those systems, and then Queen Alexandra, and we installed theirs as well. And Queen Alexandra's is quite a bit smaller. It's about a third of the size of Evansdale, and it just matches their consumption. They're not as big a haul, and don't use up as much as. And I don't think you guys have your rink. You don't have any rink lights at the moment, right?
They're being installed.
Right. So for most community leagues that have older rink light systems that haven't been upgraded to LEDs and stuff, they can be a major portion of the consumption.
How about Belgravia? What was that? Like that they're already building?
I'm not sure in terms of Belgravia. It was listed as this year, and it's because the number is quite an accurate number. I'm assuming they have a quote for that, but whether it's actually installed yet or not, I'm not sure.
The last I heard, it was in the process of.
So how'd you compile this data?
Sure, yeah.
Nice. Cool.
Yeah, these are just the ones that I have heard about, and have either contacted me or I've heard about through grant programs or et cetera, et cetera.
Sweet.
So, there might be more out there.
Okay, go back one more time. So there are how many? 1, 2,
18.
Nice.
Yeah.
And Riverdale, they've done 2 systems, and I'm not sure how close you guys are to 100% offset.
I say we're there.
Okay.
And not only that, but unlike Evansdale, we don't have any incandescents in our buildings. So take that. Not that I'm competitive at all.
Evansdale took a slightly different philosophy. Mine always is to reduce consumption, and then you can. And I'll show you an example of this for Grosvenor. If you reduce your consumption first, you have to buy a much smaller system of solar. And Evansdale's kind of taking it the other way. They're kind of putting on the biggest solar they can put on, and then they're going to reduce their consumption. So they have incandescent light bulbs in their building and stuff like that. And so whatever. It depends on how your access to capital and stuff, how good that is. I'm going to talk a little bit about some nerdy stuff, because this is a kind of an important thing to understand. Power versus energy. It's very similar to, like, say, a light bulb. Okay, so power is the electricity that's consumed or generated at any given moment. So when you buy a light bulb, it's always in wattage. So it's a 100-watt bulb or something like that. But when you get your electricity bill, it shows it your consumption in kilowatt hours. So it's the wattage you use over time. Okay, and solar, when it generates electricity, it does the same thing. You buy it a certain size, but depending on how long the sun is out for and stuff like this over the course of the year, then it generates energy over that time. And so the two are slightly different. So there's power, and then we have energy. And energy is in kilowatt hours, and power is in kilowatts.
That's the best description I've yet heard. Ever.
Because it's very confusing for people. They're like, well, I have, if you go back to this previous list, I have a 1.25 kilowatt system. But what does that mean? So it means that when the sun's out at noon or something like that, and it's peaking, it'll peak at 1.25 kilowatts or 1,250 watts. But because it's picking up energy throughout the whole year, it might generate something like 1,500 kilowatt hours a year, something like that. Okay? And it varies, that varies, depending on where you are in the world as well. And I'll get to that in a minute. Now, in terms of when you're doing a solar assessment, the price of the solar is based on the wattage of it, because that determines the size of it. Okay, so so when you get a quote, it's going to be quoted on a per watt basis, basically. Okay, and right now you're looking at around $3 a watt as kind of a rough rule of thumb. There's some variation in there, and it depends on lots of factors, but that's where the price comes from. But what you're interested in is the energy, because that's what you're paying for on the bill. Okay, and so that can be affected by some other design factors that we're going to talk about: which direction it faces, the tilt of it, how much shade there is, how much sunlight you get in a year, all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of factors to determine the ratio between the power of the system and the energy that it produces over the course of the year. Okay? And here's an example of it. This is just a internet monitoring that most of the systems come with. I would say they all should come with them. There's no reason not to. And they're usually included for free with the system. This is a single day. And I would say this is here 1 p.m., which is actually solar noon. So this is the peak. 5.96 kilowatts here in the middle. But you can see that in the morning it starts out slow, ramps up to noon, and then ramps down into the evening. And this little spike here is a cloud. Comes along at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or something, and just passes across the sun, and then you get that little spike there. But for this day, it produces almost 39 kilowatt hours for that day. Okay? And so the kilowatt hours is actually this gray shaded area under the graph, if anybody remembers their calculus. It's the area under the curve is actually the energy. But the wattage of the system is probably, this is now in October, so it's peak type of day. This is probably about an 8 kilowatts, 9 kilowatt system, something like that. So in October it's creating 6 kilowatts peak. Also depends on the tilt, the angle of it. If the sun is not perpendicular to the array, then you won't get the peak out of the system. So you could have a 10 kilowatt array, but if it's laying down flat or flatter than perpendicular, you won't get 10 kilowatts. You won't get a peak out of it. But there's other benefits to that I'll speak to. And so that's the difference on this graph. You have the peak power, and then you have the daily energy. And it's quite a difference of the number. Okay? But this is an important concept to get when you're talking about solar. And here's the other factor that factors into it. We all can appreciate here how much sunshine we get. And this is actually a potential solar map for Canada. And in this little window up here is Germany. And the colors show you the conversion. If you have a single kilowatt of solar, how much kilowatt hours you can get from that 1 kilowatt of solar. And it's different colors. And so Germany is by far the most solar in the world as a country. They're able to produce, the last few years, over half their electricity in the summertime on a given day from solar. If you look at the color, it's this kind of light green for most of it. And if you compare it here, this is like Prince Rupert. Has anybody ever been to Prince Rupert? Everything has moss on it. It rains all the time at Prince Rupert. And so this is the comparison that we have. So Germany is like Prince Rupert, and this is us here, one of the best places in the world. We're almost down near the bottom of this chart. And so for a kilowatt installed here, in theory, we could produce 1,250 kilowatt hours in a year. And in Hamburg, which is the same latitude as us, they would generate 850 kilowatt hours. So already, we start out with the potential to generate 50% more energy from the same amount of solar here. So we get much more bang for our buck here. The other thing that helps us is it's cool here compared to some places like, say, Arizona or Nevada, places like that. The fact that it's only 25 to 30 degrees here in the summertime actually allows us to produce almost 20% more energy than compared to some place like, say, Las Vegas or Phoenix, because it's hotter there. And the heat actually reduces the production from the solar. And it's to do with the way the transfer of the electrons flow work at an atomic level on the silicon wafers that are material that's inside the solar panels. Just an example of the kinds of the amount of solar that's installed. So in Germany, they have close to 500 watts per person installed. In Ontario, they've had a program there for about 6 or 8 years. They're getting close to 150 watts per person. And in Alberta, we have, this is from last year, 1.5 watts. So what it really shows you is that we have a long ways to go. And there's quite a potential here for it. Okay?
10 years ago, I was in Germany for a number of years, worked there for 4 years, and I was in Munich. And you go out into the countryside, and every farm shed, outhouse, anything has got a solar panel on it. I got feeling that if you stood still for more than 15 or 20 minutes, somebody would slap a solar panel on your back. It was just phenomenal how intense it is.
Yeah, it took off. So what Germany wanted to do is they wanted to get rid of nuclear generation. They came up with an incentive program where they would offer 20-year contracts to people. It's very similar to the system that Ontario adopted. Ontario, unfortunately, didn't adopt some critical parts of it, and so that led to some cost overruns in Ontario. But it was a moneymaker basically in Germany, and they did it on purpose so that people would actually do it with their own capital. So the government really didn't have to put much money into it. They just guaranteed them a price, and people would go to their banks, raise their own money, buy the systems, install them, and things like that. And actually, a lot of that stuff was initially done with community-based co-ops as well. It was very successful the way they did it.
And one of the other examples of sort of down in the trenches, creative thinking, in Germany they've got those high-speed electric trains, those intercity trains, and the engineers do this, that when they're traveling from Hamburg in the north to Munich in the south, it's uphill, it's going towards the Alps.
Right.
They're using energy. The return trip, they're going downhill, and they're saying, so they've rejigged those trains, so when they're going back to Hamburg, they're actually putting power back into the electric grid.
Right.
Cool.
And they're using it.
We used to do that in Canada with elevators. So if you go to a building that has older elevators, up until about the 80s, 90s, they used to have generators attached to them. So when the elevator went down, they would generate electricity, put it back into the building. So.
And they sell that one. Cost.
They changed the drive systems on the elevators and stuff, and it'll come back again as well.
You comment that it's money making in Germany. So
Yes.
who makes money?
The owner of the system. So it would be the homeowner, the property owner, in some cases farmers. And so if you raise them up off the ground, you could have grazing underneath of solar arrays. So you could actually have mixed farming in the same piece of land as well. And so it was another just a cash crop for a farmer. And it was actually, the incentive was high enough that it was a guaranteed 20-year return on their money. And so they couldn't get that with a traditional crop because you can't guarantee what the weather's going to be like for 20 years. But yeah, the government guaranteed them how much it was.
So the government's renting a place and then giving them the money to put on.
Yeah, you would apply and you would say, I'm going to put this big of a system on it. It's going to generate this kind of amount of electricity in a year. And the government would say, okay. And they would just sign a contract with you and say, we'll pay you. So here, we're buying electricity for around 2-3 cents a kilowatt hour at the moment on a retail basis in Alberta. They were paying 30 euro cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years in Germany at that time. And this was 15 years ago, so it's a little bit higher now. The price of electricity in Germany is a little bit higher now. And I'm not sure what their FIT program is anymore for that. These programs are generally set up to get things going, and once they hit a certain critical side, the market usually takes over, and then they kind of peel away the subsidies and stuff. And so these things are usually temporary. They're not there on a permanent basis. But it certainly had the effect that they wanted to in Germany. It was so effective, actually, that they ran out of product. There was not enough product in the world for the demand. And so then they turned it around and they created their own domestic industry as well. And 15 years ago, most of this solar product in the world was made in Germany. And so they became a big export for them. And so they actually had the vast majority of the world's solar was being made in Germany. And as the prices have dropped now, it's moved out to primarily Asia for some of the higher cost items like the solar modules. Although the inverters and stuff like that are still made in Germany. There's still quite a bit in there. Consumption pattern is also something to keep in mind. There's no batteries in most systems. They're what we call grid connected, and so you might connect the system to the grid, and you're buying and selling electricity as you either use it or generate. And so because of that, in Edmonton, this is a yearly bar chart. And so in January, in the winter months, we tend to consume lots of electricity. But in the summertime, we don't consume as much, but we have the opportunity to generate much more. And so this system here is what we call 100% offset. So basically, whatever is being consumed over the course of the year is then being generated over the same course of the year. Okay? It just occurs at different times of the year. And because of that, you do require a good quality grid as well, because you're going to buy the difference. So even though we're generating something here in January, we're only generating about a quarter of our needs. And so that other 3/4 of the needs has to come from the grid. Okay? And the systems are set up so that the way electricity works, it just flows naturally between where the source is and where the load is. And so the homeowner actually doesn't make any of these decisions at all. So if the sun comes out, starts to generate a lot of electricity, you might actually start exporting it, even in the wintertime, on a nice sunny day. But if a cloud comes across the sun, for that moment, you might actually have to buy electricity at that moment. And the system just does that automatically. Okay, there's nothing that the homeowner does. There's no technology involved. This is just the way electricity works. It just flows back and forth naturally. Okay. Because the solar is located on your property, on your roof, and so therefore it's closer to your house, the big benefit to you is that you're going to use your generation first. And so it's only the difference that you need to buy from the utility. So as Charlotte mentioned, this is how you have cost savings, because I'll get to the bill in a minute, but a big part of our costs today in Alberta are the delivery charges. And these actually, you basically are not paying those because you're not actually buying electricity, because you're generating your own electricity. And so that's the big benefit financially for us at the moment. I've already talked about most of this. We're using the same wiring. There's no additional wiring or anything. The electricity just flows back and forth on it. Typically, it just does this all on its own. Because our solar is on our house and the roof of the building, and most of our power is generated remotely because it's from coal plants or something like that we don't want to see. They're out of sight, out of mind. You're naturally going to use it up because it's physically closer to you. And as a community league, this is also another benefit. Because of that, when you have an excess amount of generation and you export it out onto the grid, it actually goes to the surrounding community. Okay, they're then going to use your electricity that you're exporting out onto the grid before the coal power comes. Okay. And so this is another selling feature as a community league, is that you are then a green generator for your community, okay? At any given time, whenever you're exporting, okay? And again, your neighbors aren't choosing that necessarily, but it's just going to happen because they're physically closer to you than they are to the centralized power plant, okay? So that's a great benefit as a community league. And there's nothing you need to do about this. This is just the way electricity works. And so we're actually taking advantage of some very inherent characteristics of electricity. This is a picture of how it works. This is what we call a solar inverter, and this converts the electricity from DC power to AC power so that everything in your building works off the solar power. So there's no special appliances required or anything. It just uses everything that's in the building already. And it's connected into the breaker panel. This happens to be Queen Alexandra's system. And so where all these breakers are, the solar comes in at the bottom here, and your grid comes in at the top, and then all your breakers are here. And so physically, as you're using up something, it just goes out the breaker and down the wire to your light or your stove or whatever you're using in the electricity. And since it's coming out of this point here, whatever's flowing into it just diverts out through the breaker and out to the load. Okay, and then if you have more coming in than you're using, then it just flows back out to the breaker, back out to the pole. Okay, it goes out to the grid.
it's a really, for me anyway, a fun experience to actually stand by the inverter and listen to it, because it whirs as it operates. And you can actually hear or feel how much sunshine you're getting just by listening to the inverter thing. It's really amazing if you're I guess, to feel how the solar radiation is actually hitting the building without actually being in it.
So this is Queen Alexandra's array here, and they have the potential to double this. And so when we installed it, we did that on purpose. We put it on the one side, and so it's expandable. They could basically double up the size. They're looking at maybe doing a net zero energy potential on the building. And so, but this is their system here. It's around 8 kilowatts. This is the screenshot of a energy monitor, whole building energy monitor. And you can see the illustration here. This little red squiggly line is your consumption all day long. So this is a 24-hour period. So from midnight to midnight. So the sun comes out around 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and then the generation starts, okay? And then it peaks at noon, and then it drops off. And this happens to be the same day as that previous one that I showed you, so there's the cloud again at 4 o'clock, okay? But you can see here that during the daytime, under the consumption, it's white. So this is what you're consuming during the daytime and offsetting with your own generation. So you're basically not buying any of this from the grid. Okay? So at night when the solar is off, the red is what you buy, so the consumption bought back from the grid. But here with the green, that's what you're selling. So you sell all that back to the grid and get paid for it.
Does your program allow you to compare the area under the red versus the area under the green?
It does. I cut off the top of the screen, but it keeps track of all that as well.
So is he net, like, export today?
I didn't look at today, because today was a cloudy day. I doubt it. But
I mean this day.
Oh, this day. Oh, yeah. No, this is a net exporter. Yeah, and this was October.
Wow.
This was only last week. So October.
October 2nd.
Yeah. So it still does pretty good.
Next month we'll have a full year of energy bills, so we'll be able to see.
What program is it that has net consumption, or does that slow us down too much to ask? I don't think our program shows our consumption.
No, the consumption. This happens to be a separate monitor, and a lot of the solar systems now are actually optioning that. You can get a whole building consumption as part of your solar as well.
I want that.
Yeah.
Is that a difficult retrofit?
It depends on the brand that you bought as an inverter, okay? And what the advantage that this has, this is a building-wide system, and so you can actually measure loads, individual loads. And so when you're doing energy upgrades, you can plan for them. You can actually measure them. So you can do one or two things. You can bring in an auditor, which is what the Green Lakes program is doing, but you can also self-audit this as well with these monitors, okay? And these are relatively cheap, actually. And so a few community leagues we've sold these to as well, because it's a great tool. Because as you know, in a league, it takes a while to get these things through the board and everything, and so they could go over several years, multiple boards, right? And so they have these tools at hand. It's really helpful. And this is actually available on the internet, so you can access this remotely. You can access it from home, and you can download the data, put it into a spreadsheet, do some analysis on it, and then you can do some cost analysis between, should you upgrade the rink lighting, or should you change a freezer, or where should you put your money?
That's
right?
so sweet. Do you think people are looking at this data at all? Do you have it on a website or anything?
We have not yet posted ours on the website, but that is our intention.
Cool.
I have a question. So during the green shade, this house actually generates power, but do they need to pay for delivery charge still for that period?
No, they actually get paid for the electricity that they export, and they're not buying anything from the grid. So they're not paying anything for electricity at the moment. They're actually getting paid.
But the fixed charge, which is a big...
So I'm going to get to that in a couple of slides. There isn't actually fixed charges. So that's one of the misconceptions that we have. So I'll get to that in a couple more slides. Okay. So one of the challenges you have here is that it's not that this necessarily gets turned around, but the levels fluctuate in the wintertime. So I would say the red would go up in the wintertime when your heating kicks in, because most of our heating is natural gas, but we're also using fans and on the furnaces, and the lights are on much more in the wintertime. So we do tend to use a lot more electricity in the wintertime than in the summertime. Also, then the sun is much lower in the sky, and so we don't have the potential to generate as much in the wintertime as we do. And so the levels kind of fluctuate throughout the year, as I showed in the previous couple of slides with the bar graph. So, you know, I picked a good one just to illustrate the whole thing, but it varies quite a bit day to day. In Alberta, since 2008, we've had what they call the microgeneration regulation, and this is basically law that the province brought in to allow property owners to generate their own electricity. Okay, and so you're allowed to generate as much as you use over the course of the year. It's free. There's no fees involved. And the utility is forced to do two things. They're forced to give you a special meter, which records electricity coming into the building and leaving the building. And then they're forced to put that on your monthly bill. And so you actually, on your monthly bill, you see a MicroGen credit for that. Okay? And that stuff was all free. And so the idea is that you could do what's known as an avoided cost. And so you're basically avoiding the cost of electricity by putting solar on your own building. Under the microgeneration regulation, it's only renewable sources of electricity. You couldn't get a diesel genset or a propane natural gas genset and just start cranking out electricity. It had to be from a renewable source. So it had to be solar, wind, or biomass, biogas, something like this. But it had to be a renewable source. The only tricky thing to it, which some people don't like, is that you have to match the generation size to your annual consumption. And so on the previous graphs, where I talked about the difference between the power, the size of your solar system, and how much potential energy it would generate in a year, this is where you have to do some comparison between, okay, I'm using 10,000 kilowatt hours a year, then I can basically generate 10,000 kilowatt hours a year. And this is kind of fuzzy because weather varies quite a bit throughout the years. You could have some losses due to snow. On each site, there could be some sites are better than others. Queen Alexandra is perfect because they have south of the hall is a athletic field, and so I don't know if everybody knows, it's just on the other side of Strathcona High. So if you walk out to the street, you can actually see the solar array. But there's no shade. It faces south. It's got a pretty good pitch to it, the roof, and there's no trees, and they're never going to put a tree there because it's an athletic field. And so it's got great potential. Some of the other halls that we've looked at, not so great. I'll show you a few examples of those. But the other thing with microgeneration regulation, it's only for grid-connected systems as well. It doesn't apply if you want to have battery storage. Okay. You can have a hybrid system. I've installed some before where they have both. Where they have, in the country, some places have grid outages, and they can go on for extended periods. And for some businesses like farmers, that can have a critical impact on you. And so I have a farmer who has a grid-tied system with battery backup. And when it goes off, when the grid goes down, he goes on batteries. And when the grid comes back on, he goes back onto the grid. And so he's basically never without electricity.
Sorry, I'm confused. He's not so he is a micro generator under the regulations?
Yes.
But with batteries?
Yes, because the system is intelligent enough to know if the grid goes down, it has to disconnect itself from the grid. It can't feed power back into the grid. And so I
don't understand. It says no battery.
Typically, under the microgeneration regulation, it's typically no batteries. Okay, if you do have batteries, you have to physically disconnect from the grid, and he has that technology.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Okay. All the solar systems in the world, the vast majority, about 98% of the market today is grid-tied. Very few off-grid systems because the batteries are expensive. What we're starting to see is these kind of partial storage systems. Doesn't make any sense in Alberta right now because we pay the same amount for electricity throughout the day. But in those jurisdictions where you pay different amounts at different times of the day for electricity, you start to see the introduction of some small amounts of storage. And what this allows you to do is charge your batteries when the power is cheap in the mornings or at night or something like that. And then when the power gets expensive, which is at supper time, you basically disconnect from the grid. You go off grid and you run on your own batteries. And then when the expensive part of the day is over, you go back onto the grid, charge them back up again. And this is all done through technology. The technology is quite simple. The other advantage of it is if you went on vacation, the systems are smart enough to know that you could actually charge your batteries in the cheap times of the day and then export during the expensive times of the day. So if you have solar, you charge your batteries from your solar, which is free, and then when it gets to be expensive, the electricity, you just sell it all back to the grid. Now, that has some consequences that were anticipated in the beginning. It's nothing to do with technology, but in places like California and that, the utilities don't like that. And so they actually have gone about suing their customers because they feel that that's not fair. Because, well, they're burdened with the task of building up the grid. So the grid is actually built for the peak demand. And so we don't use very much of the capacity of the system, just for a few hours a day. So it's just very expensive. And the utilities are tasked with, keeping the lights on all the time. And so they feel that that's not fair, that they lose then their prime customers. And at the moment, it's only a few people. But when it gets to be a certain size, then the utilities start to have problems financially. And this is one of the challenges that Germany found, was that the utilities just refused to get involved in the beginning. They were just like, we're not doing this. We know how to burn coal, and we got nuclear plants, and we're going to do that. And it got to the point where they actually, a few of them almost went bankrupt because they just completely bypassed the whole system. So,
just to make sure I understand, so to benefit from the MicroGen regulation, you can have battery backup, but you just need to be grid tied.
It has to be grid tied in order to qualify as a MicroGen, because if you're off grid, purely off grid, they don't care.
Yeah.
Because you could have a diesel generator.
Yeah.
They don't care.
But it's okay to have battery backup.
It is if the system is able to disconnect from the grid when the power goes down. Okay. And so you need some additional technology for that. Okay. Well, the risk is, and so all the solar systems, I was actually in the process of mentioning that, so all the systems are designed so when the grid goes down, your solar shuts off. And that's to protect the people who repair the grid from getting electrocuted. Okay? So that's actually a legal requirement that when the grid goes down, your solar has to go down so you don't feed power back onto the grid. Because when they go to repair it, then you could electrocute somebody. And so that's one of the conditions of it. Okay?
So I just have a question. So if I have a beast of a hall that right now is like sucking more electricity and whatever, and I'm going to use this micro, and I'm going to use my annual consumption to determine what size solar I'm going to put up on that roof. So if I decide tomorrow to put solar up tomorrow, and I've got this terrible annual consumption, but then after I put the solar up, I turn around and fix all my consumption problems so that now I'm using 75% of what I was using before.
Right.
Is there any penalty or is no?
So the approval is only done when you first make the application. So that's a wrinkle in the system. So when you make the application, you send in a copy of your utility bill and the size of the system that you want to install, and the utility looks at it at that point, and they go, okay, they're roughly the same, so sure.
So
you could do that.
And I'm just going to ask you the other question, the other logical question, just because I know where things are in my home board, so to speak, is how long would it take from now to actually put that in place? How long are we talking?
Depends on how big the system is. So they're generally a week to 2 weeks to install. So Evansdale, it took us 2 weeks to install 26
so
kilowatts.
I don't have to wait months to do this. I could conceivably do it in short order.
That's one of the benefits solar has. It's one of the fastest things to install.
Yeah, the physical installation.
physical installation, there's obviously, you have a board, so trust me, that will take much longer. I think Queen Alexandra, I think we started talking to them in April. We installed in October, and then we did it in a week. Yeah, when it snowed, so it was a week, but it was really a week and a half because of the snow. But yeah, and that's a strategy that's used by a lot of people. And keep in mind that you're a community league, and so most of this, what you're going to do is you get all this grant money, right? So it doesn't actually matter to you whether you do the efficiency upgrade before or after the solar, right? Solar right now, it's still getting around 70%, I think, of it's granted.
Yeah.
70% of your system is granted, so that's pretty. So 50% of it is through CLIP. 20% of it, of the whole system, is done through MCCAC.
Yeah, and there are other sources you can have access to. In my experience, it was renters ran out of, they fulfilled their quota. You know, unless you get your application in quick, they may fill up their quota before you get your application.
And Evansdale, one of the two systems was 100% granted. So it's like, why would you not do that? So then this is the difference between a community league, and so even your energy efficiency upgrades will also be granted as well, right? And so this is really just a question on how the board wants to proceed with it, right? Quite honestly, most of the community leagues I've seen do not have enough roof space to do 100% offset.
We got enough.
And
it's south.
Yours is Bellevue? Yours is Bellevue? Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what your consumption is, but I know the hall. So, yeah. They're all terrible. This is terrible too.
Work to my benefit. What it sounds like.
It can. It can. So this is an example of a bill. This is a few years old because this is a copy of mine when I was with EPCOR. I'm not with EPCOR anymore. But this is just a typical, and it's a residential bill, so there's a couple things that don't make sense for commercially. Most of the community leagues are commercial. They all are commercial. But anyways, it says here RRO, which is a regulated rate option. Okay, and so that's a fluctuating bill. The energy charges fluctuate every month, and that's what most people in Alberta are on, because when they went to deregulate electricity, there was some contract salespeople that were slightly unethical, and they locked people into fixed term contracts. And so most people stayed away from contracts and stayed with the regulated rate option. So this is the traditional system. And at the moment, it's the cheapest because the demand's dropped off on the electricity sector. So actually the regulated rate option is super cheap at the moment. But it tends to be very volatile. And so at sometimes, like 3 years ago, I was recommending people go to fixed price contracts, because it just locks in your, for the budget purposes. Then your electricity is not jumping up and down every month. So it's broken into two pieces: electricity energy charges and delivery charges. And under the energy charge, you have so many cents a kilowatt hour. And because this is EPCOR, they read the meter partly through the month, so you have 1 month and the second month, and two different rates per month, and so two different amounts. And then you have this administration charge. This is the one fixed charge. This goes to what's known as the retailer. You have three parties in our electricity sector today. They have generators. Traditionally, let's say the coal plants out in Wabamun. Then you have the distributor, who we know as EPCOR here. EPCOR owns all the transmission lines in the city and stuff, so we consider them to be the distributor. They also own the meters as well. And then we have retailers. And retailers, there's a wide choice of retailers you can pick from. Most people are on EPCOR as well as a retailer, but it's a different company. It says EPCOR, but if you look at the really tiny little numbers beside it, it's EPCOR. This here is EPCOR Distribution and Transmission. And at the top of the page, it would be EPCOR Retail. Okay? And there are actually legally two companies, two separate companies. Okay, so EPCOR got broken up. NMAX and EPCOR are these big utilities. They got broken up into generator, distributor, and retailer legally. So they had to be three legal separate companies. But because they kept the same name, it's confusing to a lot of people.
Question: generator, distributor, and transmission and retailer. So the transmission goes with the distributor?
Yes. Yes, it's there's a subtle difference. If Gordon was up here, he'd tell you a long story about this. But there's a slight difference between transmission and distribution.
Okay.
But it's, for the most part, it's you pay one party for both. They pay the transmission company directly.
Okay.
You don't pay them; they pay them. But you have the electricity energy charges,
The
and
distributor pays the transmission company, you're saying, okay.
So is the retailer sector for EPCOR regulated entity?
no, retailing is not regulated. It's competitive. It's deregulated. Out of the three parties, generation is deregulated, retail is deregulated, and distribution is regulated.
Because now we have a choice to choose regulated or non-regulated. So when I choose regulated, I go with EPCOR,
Yes.
but I still pay for their non-regulated entity, the fee.
So you can't choose the generation. So this is where Alberta differs from some deregulated jurisdictions. You can't, for instance, you can't say to EPCOR, I want 100% of my electricity to come from wind. They don't have that option because it's pooled. If that makes sense. When you go to the regulated rate option, there's only 4 companies in Alberta that are allowed to offer the regulated rate option: EPCOR, NMAX, Direct Energy, and ATCO. Because they were quite large before, and so they actually were the original ones that were kept that as a regulated rate option. Everybody else has to offer a fixed contract. Okay? But there's probably, I don't even know how many retailers there are. Like 30 or 40. There's lots of them. Okay? But this is how your retailer gets paid. It's through the administration charge. So this actually varies a lot. Okay, so EPCOR now is around $5, $5.30. NMAX is closer to $8. So every retailer has a different fee. Rural Electrification Associations, REAs, are as low as $1 for that. But they're owned by the members. So if you're getting electricity from them, you actually own them. The delivery charges. This is where most people think this is fixed. This is everyone's perception is, oh, this is all fixed. There's nothing I can do about it. Well, strangely enough, here they give you your consumption 300 here and 70 here, so 370 altogether. And here they repeat the same number, 370 kilowatt hours. And this is because all of this is based on your consumption. Okay, it's not fixed. Okay, it's all based on your consumption. There's only one thing in here buried in the distribution charge. Part of that is a fixed cost. Okay, so there's only 2 fixed costs, and I have a slide. Next slide will show that. These riders here are because it's regulated. This is transmission and distribution, so this is regulated. They have to apply for the rate to the regulator, which is the Alberta Utilities Commission. If they make a mistake on how much they want to ask for, they go back and say, oh, we made a mistake. We didn't ask for enough money, or we asked for too much. And so generally the riders are credits because when they asked for the money to start with, they made a mistake and asked for too much, and now they have to give it back to you. And so these tend to come and go all the time. And you see they're called Rider J, Rider K. They're all various amounts. And they're on just for short periods of times. And they drop on and drop off all the time. Okay? And it's all public information. Alberta Utilities Commission publishes all this stuff. The transmission charge, 100% of this transmission charge is based on your consumption. And distribution, at the moment, about half of it is a daily charge. And the other half of it is based on your consumption. And the last one is the local access fee, which is based on your whatever municipality you live in. We all live in Edmonton. So Edmonton's actually is also based on your consumption. In some jurisdictions like Sherwood Park, Strathcona County, it's actually a flat fee. Everybody pays a flat fee. So even if you reduce your consumption, it still stays the same. And then what I don't show here is the GST as well. So the GST is also based on your consumption, because it's a proportion of the bill. So if you lower your bill, you even lower the GST. Okay? Sorry, Rocky, you were going to ask something?
Yeah, just see if I got it straight. So that delivery charge is based on consumption, in that distribution is half based on consumption, transmission 100% based on consumption.
You can actually see what the percentages are. Like there's a place on internet, you can actually go and see what.
Yeah.
If you were really bored one day, I can actually show you. Because this is regulated, this section is regulated. They have to apply for this regulation, and the regulator has to approve it, and so it's all publicly accessible.
And I missed who sets the local access fee, the municipality?
This is based by the municipality, and on your bill it says this is not regulated by the AUC. This is determined by the jurisdiction. And what this fee is you have those power lines coming down the power poles coming down your street, and then it crosses the sidewalk to get onto your property. Well, the city owns the sidewalk, and so to cross city property, you pay for that. That's why they call it a local access.
Nice. Well,
You're renting space for the city.
I like the fact that you've
And we have to shovel
simplified
that
this from
walk and
last
mow
year's
the-
presentation. But I think I would like to get a little nerdier on get some of those links.
This is your distribution charge. Now here's the problem you're going to have. So on the bill, they call it distribution charge, but if you go to the EPCOR site, they call it a service tariff. Okay? So they changed the name of it. So you actually have to dig a lot and translate it. So it's all there. It's all public. It's all published. But you have to figure out, okay, they say here on one thing and here on something else. That actually, to me, is a bit fishy. This is just the distribution charge, and this is current. This is for this year. This is for residential. But you can see here per day, it's 60 cents, okay? And per kilowatt hour, less than a penny. But it adds up. This adds up, okay? And so if you look at today, most bills, the distribution charge, half of that is your daily charge, and the other half is based on consumption, okay? So when you're looking at it, I wouldn't pay attention to any of these riders, including the balancing pool allocation. It's distribution, transmission, and the local access fee, or your main charges.
Yeah.
Brandon last week told us a little bit about the Energy Star portfolio monitor.
Yes.
And I went home and tried to work on that, and I could not figure out my bill what numbers to plug in to make that work, because I've got solar panels on my house.
Oh, okay.
So I've been trying to, and I'm not smart enough to develop a spreadsheet. So when he told me about this thing, I thought it was great. My prayers are answered, but I can't figure out what numbers to put in. But we don't have to waste everybody's time here. But
I wish that there are so many different. There was never a monolithic utility in Alberta. It was always regional utilities, monopolies, and when they deregulated, they should have forced them all to use the same bill format. There's a huge variety of bill formats, and some of them are a lot of the stuff's hidden. Some of it's all broken out. Medicine Hat owns its own utility. It's the only jurisdiction in the province that owns its own utility. And their bill, if I were to show it to you, every line item is based on the kilowatt hours, and it's right beside it. So like here on the EPCOR bill, where it says here, so many kilowatt hours at so many cents, on Medicine Hat, every line says that. Whoa. Okay, so the connection is clear that as I consume electricity, this is going to go up. Okay, but quite honestly, they really don't want you to reduce this. Honestly, and that's the sad part, you know. Anyways, so this is the minimum daily charge is the customer charge. So if you go home, you go on vacation, turn everything on, your house off, you're still going to pay the 60 cents a day.
I watched a program on PBS several years ago in Europe. I think it was in Denmark or Norway. The power meter was inside the family's apartment, and the couple sat down on a regular basis and reviewed the bill. And said, whoa, why'd the meter? Why'd we use so much yesterday? Oh, I did laundry. And you know, ours are at the back, on the garage at the back of the yard. You just see this bill, you pay it. Nobody's conscious of it the way they are in Europe. I was just fascinated with this family looking at, and they could figure out what happened over the last few days to change their consumption. And that really drives behavior.
So do you know how much you pay in property tax a year? Roughly?
Roughly, yes.
Okay. Do you know how much you pay in electricity a year, roughly?
Now that I have solar panels, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, not...
That's the question I always ask. So in Germany, their utility bill used to be once a year.
Oh.
Okay? And so, just like property tax.
Wow.
So they actually knew what their electricity bill was. Because they paid it, $5,000, boom. But because we pay it $300 a month, it just kind of disappears. So, anyway, I've got a few videos here of a few community leagues. Yeah, and we're going to take a break right now. But I'll just run through some of these. You guys can see some of them. So this is Rio Terrace in the West End. This is a potential 100% offset system for them. Okay. I've recommended that they don't install it like this because of structural reasons, but I'll get to that later. But potentially they could produce 100% of their electricity.
Wow. So that hasn't been installed yet. That's
No.
works.
Could we cover the rest of that?
It could, just not through MicroGen.
Even if we had electric car charging stations?
They could do stuff, yeah.
I think we need to do that.
This is Burnwood in Millwoods. A weird little building.
Yeah, one of the people last week was from Burnwood. One of the people attending yesterday.
Yeah.
And is that installed?
No.
No.
No. They're going to do their energy upgrades first. In this part of the building here, they use 10,000 watts is what they have for lighting. They have 3 skylights, and you would not believe the number of fluorescent fixtures in that room. It's well over 10,000 watts. Yeah, and they have a daycare on site, so they go through lots of power. There's Athlone, another one. They could also do 100% generation. Burnwood could not do, well, they've done some energy efficiency upgrades, so now they can do 100%, but they could not do 100% with what they had. So we show Athlone. These are all done from assessments we did last year for community leagues. So this shows 100%.
How often do you have to move penetrations around to get all this to work? How often is that?
Well, this is one of the challenges you have. So I colored some of this stuff red. Here, this is red shaded area because there's so much stuff there, it would just block everything. So you try and stay away from that. But you can see here there's a vent, a couple of vents, roof drains, stuff like that. So it gets in the way. So even though you think, oh, it's perfect, it's flat roof, there's all kinds of stuff up on the roof. You can see all the stuff here on the roof. So this is all mapped out, and does make it challenging.
That's where long-term planning makes a big difference. Get things done.
So this is Grosvenor, in just west of Glenora, and so this was what they would have required to do 100% offset. Then they did a rink light upgrade from I think here down and here down is all they need now. So it's about a quarter of the size of what they would have needed. Okay, so that's the power of upgrades, consumption upgrades. Okay, and they have two buildings here. Okay, yeah, and it's kind of a funny little building that they have as well. And this is part of the problem we have with community leagues is they're such strange little buildings. Some of them are not structurally sound. Well, I shouldn't say structurally sound, but to put solar on a building, sometimes you have to weigh them down so they don't blow off. I've got slides I'll show you after the intermission, and you start putting tons of weight on the roof, you have other problems, and so that this is sometimes the limiting factor as well. The buildings were not built for this kind of stuff. Pitched roofs like this is much easier to do on a pitched roof. Same with Queen Alexandra, because you can just bolt it to the roof, so you don't have to weigh it down. On a flat roof, you can also bolt it down, but because it can lend itself to leakage of the roof, generally you don't like to do that, so you weigh them down instead. And then the weight becomes an issue. I'm going to kind of get into the solar now, a bit more about that. I was mostly talking about the stuff leading up to it.
I just think it's so cool that we are such a big solar resource in this province.
It's great. We're true to between the cool temperatures and summer winter temperatures. So in the wintertime, when it's 40 below, you'll generate about 30% more power than you will in the summertime for the same amount of sunshine. And so it's one of the challenges we have because we have this temperature extremes. We have quite a swing in temperature throughout a year compared to some jurisdictions. But yeah, we do have a lot of benefits for that.
And I heard at NATE they did side-by-side comparisons with solar panels that they cleaned off the snow and others they didn't, and it was only about a 5% difference.
Yeah, so between the middle of November and the middle of February, so basically Remembrance Day to Valentine's Day, it's about 10% of the annual generation potential. It tends to be that's when it snows as well here. And it'll say snow near the end of November, stick around till just after Christmas, something like that, and then start doing the freeze thaw, where it starts to melt off. And so because it's only 10% of the annual generation anyways, you lose about roughly somewhere between 5 and 8% of your annual generation just due to snow coverage. The prices are so cheap now, comparatively speaking, that you can actually the suggestion today is to just add 5 or 10% to your system to compensate for that. And you can actually justify that when you make the application. You say, well, we're increasing it for lots of factors, which we're going to get into here. And all these kind of reduce the potential of your system. So generally speaking, for everybody here, that when you're talking about community leagues, it's commercial, and in commercial applications, typically it's difficult to do 100% offsets, just because of the limited roof space. We actually use a lot more electricity than a lot of people realize. I mentioned Grosvenor here as the exception, but you saw potentially they would have needed almost all their roof space, and then they did a simple upgrade and really cut that back. Also, to keep in mind, our jurisdiction here is different than a lot of other places in that our heating and hot water is usually natural gas. So when we talk about energy consumption, there's two kinds. There's your gas bill and there's your electricity bill. Some jurisdictions, it's all electricity, okay? Air conditioning can't be done with natural gas, it's electric, okay? We don't usually have much in the way of air conditioning loads here in Edmonton, but it's just something to keep in mind. So in terms of design considerations, obviously we have to think about the sun. 3 major factors with that. Orientation, so which direction does the building face or the roof face, okay? South is considered the ideal, obviously. In some jurisdictions, the west is actually considered more ideal than the south, and it's because the price of electricity, if you have different prices at different times of the day, it's highest during the peak. The peak demand is at supper time. That's when the sun is in the west. And so in some jurisdictions, they actually incentivize solar arrays to be built facing west because it's more valuable electricity. It's not that it produces any more electricity for the same amount of wattage, but it's more valuable electricity. So orientation, then angle or the pitch of the roof, okay, and ideally it would be perpendicular to the sun. That's when you get your peak. And then the other factor to take into consideration is shade. So we're at 53 degrees north latitude. Our equinox is in March 23rd or September 22nd. The angle of the sun at that case is 37 degrees from the horizon. And the way it's simple math, if you subtract this from 90 degrees, that's where you get this number from. Okay? So the angle of the sun is at 37 degrees. It seems higher than that sometimes, right? And then, no matter where you are in the world, the sun goes up and down 23.5 degrees, either below or above the equinox throughout the year. Okay? So on June 22nd, it's 60 degrees. And then on December 22nd, and this is really our challenge here, is that in the wintertime it's at 14 degrees. So not only are the days short, but the sun is very low in the sky. And at 14 degrees, if you look out across the horizon, even trees and stuff are almost at that height. And so this is really one of the biggest problems we have, being this far north. The advantage that we have of it, I tried to find a better diagram than this, but this kind of explains it. Here in the winter times, the days are quite short because the sun is low. At the equinox, it's 12 hours or 14-hour day maybe. But in the summertime, the sun comes up in the northeast and sets in the northwest, right? And so you get these huge long days, and this is really our benefit here. And so even if you change lots of other stuff, the fact that we're this far north, it's the long summer days that's always going to mean that we're going to generate more in the summertime than we consume. And honestly, we just don't use lights as much because it's still light out at supper time, and really we probably go to bed and it's still light out. Anybody who's moved here from Southern Ontario has great difficulty adjusting to that. You came from Toronto, right?
I did.
So these are two systems. This is again a solar profile here. This system faces south, and this system faces east-west. And the difference here is that this is a 7 kilowatt system, 7 kilowatt peak. These are two 4 kilowatts, so a slightly bigger system. And so the blue is the one facing in the morning, so it's facing east, and then the yellow is facing west. And if you remember your calculus again, and you add these two together, you get this purple line. And so the peak is almost the same, but you get this additional bulge in the middle of the curve. And so you actually, when you compare the two together in terms of kilowatt hours, it's very comparable. So everybody thinks, oh, you have to face south, but actually east-west here works quite well. Now this is particular to the summer, okay? In the wintertime, you see quite a difference between the two, but the wintertime it's not great even if you face south. And so really, you're not giving up a lot. What you gain here in the summertime actually might even compensate for what you lack in the wintertime. And so this far north, the east-west orientation is actually quite a good system. And this gray shaded area is the peak demand period. And so you can see here that you actually get a little bit more energy out of this system during peak demands. And so in the future, the prices are going to be based, they will vary throughout the day because this actually drives consumption patterns. And so every mature jurisdiction does this. And so Alberta will too. Alberta will bring in time of day pricing. And then this is then when it starts to make much more economic sense to have your systems face west than south. Okay? Facing south as well, this conventional thinking was that, okay, this little fat black line was a solar panel. It would face south. This is around Christmas time in the early morning when it's really the worst. So most of the solar days when we're doing design is from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. So this is the beginning of the solar day, worst time of the year. It's what we call inter-row shading. So if you put a module up here, the sun would just clip the top of it and go down and hit the bottom of the one behind it. And so if you put these two close together, it would actually shade the module behind. So you'd have, if you think of it, you'd have rows and rows and rows of these. If you get them too close together, when the sun goes down or goes low in the sky, it just shades them all. And so this actually determines the fact that you have to actually spread them apart. And so when you start to look at this on a flat roof, this is one thing if it's in a field, but if it's on a flat roof, then all of a sudden this has got 4 meters in between. This is 4 meters is 15 feet or 14 feet. This is a lot of roof space where you just have space in between and not much roof. And so what you do this is a 30-degree tilt. So what you would do is you would flatten these out so you get them closer together. Okay? And so it's not as effective because it's flattened out and less perpendicular to the sun, but you can put more on the roof and get more density out of it. Okay? So that's for flat roof buildings, that's a design consideration. The other problem we have here is shade. This is this building. This is their little solar array on the roof. And it doesn't look like much, but there's a great big tree here. And actually this causes quite a shadow across the building. And this is typical of Edmonton. We have a lot of trees in the city. So even though it's a flat roof, it's up fairly high, seems to be a good thing. We still have to take this into consideration, the shade. So really, you wouldn't put solar down at this end of the building. Okay? Then there's wind.
People are changing their landscaping to, have shorter trees for shade.
Sure. In California, they have what they call solar access rights, and so you can actually force your neighbor to cut his tree, trim his tree, because it's blocking the sun. Okay. Here, The city of Edmonton there's a two-headed beast. They want to encourage renewable energy, but then they also have this
force. So we have the two, and housing infill with the houses getting taller. And Illinois had a tree in the middle of their ring they wanted to cut down, and the city said no, it's just going to do it. But we did an analysis for them showing us about $1 in electricity a year, because it was a microinverter system. The other design factor is wind. This is what happens when you don't balance your system. And clearly, this isn't attached. Not very well attached. And this is the part with front models that people don't appreciate is they're not very heavy, but they're basically your head. And actually wind forces are about 8 times the compression force. And so this is actually a significant factor. And we don't have to worry about it because we're not living in a hurricane zone. If we live in Florida, we have to consider this when we build houses. And we don't consider that here because we think of the compression forces, which is slow. And so houses are built for compression, but not for wind lift. So when we install solar, this is the thing we have to consider. Okay? And so there's two ways to do it. You can bolt it down, or you can weight it down. And bolting it down is pretty straightforward, but nobody likes to do that on a flat roof because nobody wants to take the risk of the roof leaking, and so then we go to weighing it down. But as a community, this can be a challenge because if you have a room that's like a hall, which is a big span between the walls, that's something that has to be looked at as part of the solar design. You guys don't have to worry about it, but when you hire a contractor, that's the factor that they need to consider, okay? And they need to bring in a structural engineer. This is Mason's, by Mason's system that you guys are familiar with. And here you see concrete blocks here. So this building is quite old, it's not a very good building. Specifically saying it's a wood-ish sort of building. And so we had this engineered, and clearly that's a fair amount of weight out here. It's about 1,200 pounds for 8 modules. So a fair amount of weight. Part of the factor is because this is in 45 degrees. It's at 45 degrees so you can see it from the street. Because it's in the wrong way, you can see it from the street. And so obviously,
consideration. But it does actually get good production.
Off of a smaller
Or
rate,
has
too.
there been any thought of designing these so that, the reason there's gravel up there is to ballast the roof for the membrane that's underneath,
Yes.
right?
And keep the sun off of it.
Has there been any development of racking that uses the gravel as part of the ballast? In other words, making a pan so that you can use the same weight to serve both purposes.
It's a possibility. Early days they used to use water. So the open tubs and water, because you just bring a hose on the roof and fill the pail up. But it used to evaporate. And so this is the problem with water as ballast, right? And so basically you have to use concrete today. And it's really, I think if you did a holistic design where you design the building for this, you would honestly build penetrations in. You wouldn't put ballast on. You would just build the roof so you could bolt it down. And honestly, when you see properly designed buildings, they don't actually put the solar on the roof. They put it above the roof. And so you can walk underneath of it. And then you can come in and repair your air conditioner and all that other kind of stuff that's underneath the roof. It shades the roof, extends the roof life, all that kind of stuff. So if it's properly designed, it's not an issue to put it elevated above. But we're doing mostly retrofit, existing buildings, adding something to it that they were never designed for. So that's always the challenge. So what happens when the wind picks up? So the solar didn't go anywhere, but you can kind of see this awning sitting. This is the neighbor's property. So you can kind of see that awning sitting there. And then all of a sudden the wind come along and blew this right over, rolled onto the solar. Okay. But the solar didn't go anywhere. And it didn't damage the solar at all. Okay. Weight. And this is because of the additional weight you need to weigh down the solar. Okay. Typically the biggest problem is that the structure's not designed for this balance because it's point loads too. And this is part of the problem too. You may have to relocate where you want to put the solar just because you can't put that weight in that spot. It has to go somewhere else, right? So it's a combination of stuff. Particularly for community leagues, if you have a hall with a large span, it may not be designed for that kind of weight either. And honestly, the problem with community leagues is there's just a huge variety of buildings, you know. This is a solution I was telling Kenneth about. This has become, I would say, the go-to standard for commercial flat roofs. It's what's known as a dual tilt. It varies by manufacturer, but it's like roughly between 10 and 15 degrees between the two. This is actually north-south in this direction, and so these face east-west, okay? And so, does everybody know the Mosaic Center? It's a net zero building, yes? Okay, and so their system is flat, okay? And there's a couple of challenges, and the reason they did that was it's relatively simple to install. You just lay them down flat, and you need the least amount of ballast because the wind can't really get underneath of them and pick them up very well. The problem with that is you get dirt accumulation on it, and it doesn't shed water very well, things like that. So this is actually the commercial solution to this. And because of this, it acts as a windbreak. So the wind actually just goes across these modules, and the only place you can really get at it is at the end of them, okay? And so this requires a lot less ballast. And because the price of solar has dropped so much in the last few years, you can actually get the most number of solar modules on the roof. Because if they were flat, they take up this much square footage. If you tilt them a little bit, they take up a little bit less square footage. But the production is the same or perhaps even better than flat. And so you get more solar in the same square footage. And so this is really the flat roof solution that most areas are seeing as well, okay? And here what happens is that most of the sun movement is during the daytime, from morning to evening. That's when the sun moves mostly. With tilting the systems, we were always worried about the seasonal adjustment, right, between spring and fall and stuff. But this is actually where most of the movement of the sun is. And so this is actually, you get an east-west dual tilt like this, you actually get pretty good production off of, okay? But it's the power density on the roof that's a big deal. Internet monitoring is with most systems. Okay, this is actually Evansdale's here, so it gives you, generally, they're all the same. CO2 emissions saved. And we can recalculate the formula for some of these because some jurisdictions have a different energy mix. So they'll have hydro, nuclear, coal, natural gas. In Alberta, it's predominantly coal. I don't know if people realize that we have 13 coal generation plants to the west of us here. This generates twice as much energy as what we consume in Edmonton, in the Edmonton area. There's other generation points as well. So we actually are a net exporter. We're the only region in the province. The province is split up into 5 generation regions. We're the only region that actually has a net export. And we provide basically baseload to the entire province. But because it's coal power, we get the health effects of it in Edmonton. Everybody else gets the electricity. So here, CO2 emissions, equivalency to trees planted or light bulb powered in a day. So Evansdale, this is a year now. It's equivalent to having 41,000 incandescent light bulbs.
Yeah.
And then you get this too, where they give you each month the generation, okay? And the colors change because it's the next year, okay? So this system we installed in November, and anyway switches over. And then you can see the system here with the 2 arrays. It actually was almost split down the middle. They did one in 2015 and the second one in 2016. But this is pretty much standard with every system, internet monitoring.
Can you get solar framed modules anymore?
Yes, you can. You still can. Some varieties of things that you can do. Awnings. So it doesn't all have to be on the roof. It can be on the wall. Structurally, this is actually much simpler to do because you have much less wind lift. It also serves a dual purpose. Here you're seeing it shading the windows. And so if you have a lot of heat load, south-facing windows in the summertime, you can get a tremendous amount of heat. An awning serves 2 purposes. It shades the windows in the summertime, and in the wintertime the sun comes in to allow you to heat the building with the sun. Okay, and so you can hang them on the walls quite easily, and they can be made to look fairly attractive, right? This is quite nice with a custom gable on it as well. Pergola, bandstand. So Riverdale has done something very similar to this. Okay.
These are beautiful, though. The aesthetics are so nice. Is that going to be waterproof? Like, is that? Yeah. Like, is that frame? Is the racking and framing such that no water will be coming through that?
Who
knows?
I don't know on this one.
Okay.
This is just a photo I pulled off the internet.
Okay.
It can be. It can be.
Because I mean, you go to all the trade shows, I imagine. So are they coming out with this kind of?
This can be actually quite cost comparison. So you can get what's known as a bifacial module, which is a transparent module, and I've got some this year that are very, very price comparable to regular modules. Okay, they just may not have quite the fancy aesthetics that some of these have. But some of these, if you have frameless modules and stuff, the price of them isn't that expensive. It's really hard to get them because nobody buys them. And so then you have to buy a bulk of them, and you have to buy a lot to get a little. And that's really what the problem is. But this is just basically a deck that's sheltered, okay? And so it's a shade element. And this, you can see the cells. These are the actual solar cells. And normally they have a white back on them. But in this case, they put a transparent backing on them. And you can see right through them. And it's basically like tinted glass.
We should get you Riverdale system, and then I can Photoshop some aesthetic elements into it.
We should.
But it's just to show you that there's other things to do than just the roof, okay? Or some ugly commercial solar array. The other thing I get asked a lot is, what about hail? Who was going to ask that question? Somebody was going to ask that question.
What about hail?
Or kids with rocks.
Rain tests.
So this is CSA.
To ensure that the modules are going to withstand the
impact and scratch resistance. Mike Pinder, Senior Lab can pay for themselves in 4 to 5 years after tax credits and rebates. To learn more about CSA International Solar Testing.
Yeah, that's a job.
So that's, I edited that and cut a lot of the crap out, which is why the audio is not so good. But everybody asked me this question, what about hail? So they actually tested for that. Safety glass, and then they do this impact test and a glass cutter test on it as well before they become CSA approved. If you don't have modules that are CSA approved, the utility will never let you connect to the grid. And so that's a requirement to get an electrical permit and to pass electrical inspection and to be connected into the grid. You have to have a CSA approved module. And that basically gives you this hail resistance testing as well. Okay.
I have a question. Talk about it. What's the, I've heard you get a warranty, 25-year warranty on solar panels, but how much do they decrease in effectiveness over time?
It varies on the manufacturer, but roughly it's less than 1% a year. Okay. And so after 25 years, you have 80% of the original factory warranty. And so that's what the performance warranty is given. So generally they have a 10-year manufacturer's warranty, which is against workmanship and defects. And then they have a 25-year performance warranty. And they basically warranty that after 25 years, the degradation, the losses is caused from sunlight. Ultraviolet radiation. So if you want them to last forever, you just keep them inside. And they will just never degrade. Get them in the box. They're great. So that's unfortunately one of the side effects of it. So, but it's a linear degradation, so it loses the most in the first year. And then after that, it loses a predictable amount.
So you know it's 8 o'clock then.
Okay. But it would be the same after 50 years. It would be another 20%. Okay. So Charlotte mentioned this, that they could last a long time. In theory, they could last 100 years, because every 25 years you lose another 20%. And, you know. The ones in space that were made originally for the first satellites, they made several, and they kept one on the ground here. Fired the rest into space. They still trot it out at trade shows every year, and it still works from Bell Labs. And that's 58, I think, 1958 they built it. So solar cells were invented solar voltaics were discovered in the 1800s. The first solar cell was built in the 1880s. It had a 1% efficiency. So they've been around a long time, right? But it's really not until silicone wafers came along that it became a popular thing. Okay.
Charlotte's asked me to just speak a little bit about what the experience was like to get our system installed on the roof. As Warren's mentioned, the solar array on our building is capable of offsetting 100% of our current electricity consumption. So we're really lucky in that we've got a really, really good site. In terms of in terms of our experience, I think probably the most important things I'd like you to understand is that the solar installers actually do a huge amount of the heavy lifting, so to speak, in terms of applying for the permits, in terms of managing the delivery of the materials and installing it on the roof and getting the grid connection details handling the electrical inspection, all those sort of directly electric solar aspects of the installation. Okay, so in that sense, the installers are a great help, and that's part of the package of getting the system installed. The key things that we as leagues need to be on top of, I think, is actually understanding that the business people operate on a much faster time scale than leagues generally do. Okay, so when they're ready to go, that means they're ready to go like right now. Like, are you there yet? Have you got that yet? Have you got that yet? Right? And so if you want to maintain a good relationship with whatever installer you pick, it's really important that in the early going that you talk about with your board in terms of who's doing approvals, who's got the signing authority on the various documents, that they fully understand that when that call comes, it means that we need to be able to do it right now. Like, not next week, not at the end at the board meeting. We need to be able to act really, really quickly. The other thing to remember is that these guys are up on the roof likely, and if it's a sloped roof, it's a dangerous place for them to be if it's cold or icy or there's snow up there. The shingles on the roof, if they're tar shingles, aren't going to accept being worked with when it's really cold. So you want to be working the timing of your overall project so that, and they're going to be watching for this too, is that they're up on the roof at a time that's safe for them to be there. So be very, very careful about your overall project timing. When are you getting your funding and all that kind of stuff, okay? So a lot of this relates to making sure one world is working well compared to the other world. In terms of the other, I think, really important thing is picking the right installer. One of the reasons that our Queen Alexandra Community League went with Warren was because I knew about Warren before we even got the project started. He and I hadn't spoken yet, and he doesn't realize this yet, but I'd been working on the background quite a bit prior to us actually approaching them to get a quote done. Make sure that you have a good basic understanding of what solar is about, and not just the modules themselves. A significant part of your solar installation, and in my view, an important part of how happy the league is going to be with the finished work is what about all the electrical details? I don't know if you noticed it in the picture there was a picture of the array on the roof of our building, but on every single quote that I had gotten done for our solar array, I got a different answer from the installer as to how and where they were going to route all the wiring, how they were going to penetrate either the roof or the walls, what they were going to use to protect that wiring, how they were going to mount it on the system, what kind of technology they were going to use to attach the modules to the roof, et cetera, et cetera. So you may be surprised at just how different these quotes actually look, one from the other, when you get some quotes done. So I would strongly recommend that if you're serious about getting a solar installation. By the way, how many of you are actually seriously looking at getting a solar installation put on? 1, 2, for sure? Okay. Make sure that you take advantage of the huge resources that are available in this province, largely in the form of the Solar Energy Society. They have a regular program of solar seminars to help us get a better understanding of what solar is about. But almost more importantly, a lot of the solar installers themselves show up at these events because they want to have access to us. Right? So here's a chance for you to hear what they have to say, understand their perspective on how they approach what it is that they do, because their approaches do vary. And it also gives you a chance to say, okay, you know what, the way that installer operates is more in line with what we think we want for our building and how we want it approached. One of the reasons that I went with Warren is when I was talking with him, I could tell right away that he and I were going to be able to speak the same language and approach the problem in the same way. And that, I think, is a really important thing, given the preciousness of our time, that we need to be able to speak to one another and get a good communication connection right off the bat. Pardon me? I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that.
In Star Trek, I think they talk Klingon as a language.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Okay, I'm just going to let that go. I can tell I didn't react correctly in the first place. In terms of some of the challenges that I went through, I guess one of the biggest learning events for me was actually the negotiating of the solar contract. I really had a tough time with that one, and I would recommend that that if you yourself, as the leader of your project, are not particularly knowledgeable about working with contracts, that you actually do a little bit of homework ahead of time in terms of how a lot of these contracts are structured. Understand the language, understand what the contractors are going for by the terms they tend to use, and have a game plan ahead of time prior to actually getting a contract from your contractor in terms of what you as a league want to actually see. It's also a really good idea to have a committee, if you're running on the basis of a committee for your project, to have a mixture of people with different skill sets. People that are good for writing out funding agreements, although we now have Charlotte to help us with that kind of thing. People that are good with contracts, people who have a good understanding of when they're looking at an electrical installation, they actually understand what it is that they're seeing. If that's not a strength that you have, then look for somebody in your community or on your board that is able to see deeper into an installation. One of the things I really liked about Evergreen and Gold's proposal was the fact that they were going to use rigid conduit, for example, to get the energy from the panels into my building and all the way through. Not all the contractors are offering that. That's my particular bias, that's my particular preference. I like the way that they were installing the system on the roof. So have people on your board that have a diversity of skill sets so that you can cover all these bases. Another thing that came up when we were negotiating the contract was make sure you have a really clear understanding in your mind about what your definition of success and failure is for the installation. And make sure your solar contractor understands what those things are up front. Okay, so that they can make sure that they set up their quote even, but particularly the final installation that meets all of those particular things that you're actually watching for.
So on that point, how did you present that to your contractor? What
we did, okay, that's a very good question. What we did is I think it was a list of like 10 items I think we came up with that was our definition, and that basically forms your checklist then when the solar installation is finished and electrically inspected and everything. Now you take that list and you actually walk through the installation and look for those points. And then you check them off. And if there's any deficiencies or shortcomings at that point, then it's very clear, yes, this is what we talked about at the beginning. This isn't a surprise for the installer when you finally get to that point, right? And then there's an opportunity to correct that. And then once all of those punch list items, if you like, are signed off on, then the final part of the remittance is offered. Yeah.
Not to like open up a whole can of worms, but is that something that the ESCL could think about? Is having, like, I'm thinking that you may be intimidating some of us right now. We're thinking, well, holy crap, like, could that not be maybe something that the ESCL thinks about, that the Green League thinks about offering going forward? That, like, so you're doing the solar assessments, but then could there be like solar assessment plus project management or something, like the vetting of or how does that, I mean, it's just a little bit, if you don't know, how do you know?
There are several avenues
Yeah.
you can take, and it is my hope to have kind of a checklist of things to watch out for, things to do.
So this is going to be a work in progress.
Don't let me overstate it. I mean, the installation ought to conform with the building code and the electrical code anyway. It should.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, a reputable installer is going to do that because he doesn't want to sully his reputation by doing substandard work, theoretically. But you, as a representative of the community, and also of your funders, quite frankly, you want to kind of stand up there and say, okay, I know enough about this that I know what I'm looking at, and feel confident that it's been done.
And the Solar Energy Society is working on a program that's funded by the province to bring in some type of a mediation, best practices to start with, kind of standards for the contractors that are listed through their site, and then also to bring in a mediation process in case one of the clients isn't happy with the results they get. And so this is actually something they're working on right now for that exact reason, because the province is also concerned that if people start to get ripped off or feel they got ripped off, what do they do?
Developed or something. I mean, I guess you get 3 quotes and then you sort of try to compare apples and apples. But
my suggestion would be to err on the side of getting more quotes than you might otherwise normally do, if for no other reason than to help you get an understanding of the different ways that the project can be approached. And one of the things that I found is as the process of soliciting the quotes, it was a really good opportunity for me not only to get the quote, but in a sense interview the installer to get a sense of what perspective they were approaching the problem from. Okay, are these people more interested in their bottom line as a business? Are they more interested in a mutual success on behalf of us as a league and them as an installer? Where are they coming from? What is the bias that they're having, and do I agree with that, or do I want that? Is that something I can work with? So that quoting process, because they have to actually come and look at your site at some point, it's a really good opportunity to do some of your learning. Remember also that the Solar Energy Society has information on their website in terms of what a broad range of solar installers' credentials actually are, what they're capable of doing, what they're not capable of doing. So that's a good place to start to say, okay, who are the installers in the province? Who can I access? And I think there's some information on there in terms of what to look for in terms of contracts and things like that as well. Yeah, and that's very good too as well. Remember also that one of the programs that the Solar Energy Society offers is what they call an eco-solar home tour. And one of the ways that I got to know who some of the installers in the province actually are and who's doing most of the work for who and that kind of thing is through that opportunity as well, where you actually get to see installed systems really close to home and actually talk to them at that time, even before you're even ready to ask for quotes and that kind of thing too. So it really is an opportunity to get to know who the players are and what they're about, and you can actually look at their work and say, okay, yeah, I like that, or I didn't like that, or you can actually ask questions and that kind of thing too. There's a series of steps that are involved in doing a project, right from okay, have I got approval to even investigate this, right through to okay, I've met the last requirement of my funding agency, because it's not just the solar installation, but now you've got commitments that you've made in terms of complying with the agreement for getting your funding. I'm not going to bore you with all those things now, but if you want, as part of the resources for the thing, we can cobble something together to help you understand the various steps that you want to consider along the way. Beyond that, I'm not going to make it any more complicated than that.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Are you available for field trips to your location?
Personally?
Yeah. Could we come and take a look at your...
Oh, absolutely. Please do. Yeah. We should all as a group go trundling over there and have a look. One of the awesome things about solar is, in a lot of ways, it's really boring. Like it's great, right?
no gears and stuff.
Yeah.
Second question. I haven't had a lot of experience with this, but I've got the impression that you were your own project manager, and so you were doing for the league.
Right.
I have got an impression, rightly or wrongly, that sometimes a project manager may have their own stable of preferred suppliers. So you may not be getting all the, so how do you balance that of getting somebody to manage the project for you because you don't have the expertise in-house, but they've got
I think solar's
they've
a
got
little
their own pool
right.
that they choose from, so so you're not getting the 3 quotes, you're getting the guy that he's worked with for the last 5 years.
Solar's a little bit different than, say, a construction project that you would have, where you'd have a general and then sub-trades, right? So most of the solar providers are turnkey providers that take care of everything. And so really, I think if you just got a few quotes from various solar installers, you'd basically get a package price for everything. And from the league side is not a lot of stuff that you have to do. What you'll find is contractors will use different products, different
Yes.
brands, okay? And so within that, you can get variations, right? And so this is something you'd probably want to ask, but it's almost like cars, though. Like one's a Ford, one's a Dodge, and one's a Chevy, and yeah, some people like Chevys and some people like Fords, but they all get to where you're going in the same way, kind of. And so, and to Kenneth's point too, there's reasons why some contractors use one product over another product and stuff like that, right? And so I would say that's probably your bigger variation on it. But I don't really see the need for a project manager. When you get into your energy efficiency stuff, then if you're doing big stuff like lighting upgrades and insulation, and that becomes a much bigger project. But the solar actually is pretty straightforward. It's one of the nice things about it. It's pretty clean. What do you think, Rocky? You've gone through it a couple times.
Yeah.
Compared to, I don't know if you've done.
I think ignorance is bliss. And I kind of just sort of had a lot of faith because it just seems, because my experience is similar, getting to know people through the Solar Energy Society, and I don't know. So, there are a lot of people that have done quite a few projects, and so like yourself, it's kind of, you just sort of learn to trust some of the leaders in the community, but I don't know. Yeah, I can be easily duped, so I don't know.
Yeah, some of the early contractors were quite careful to establish a high quality industry locally, and so that was. But it's expanded a lot in the last couple of years, so there's. You do have to be more careful.
Yeah,
now
so I like your advice of just consulting with the Solar Energy Society's list as well, and talking to other leagues, and going with some of the tried and true.
Yeah, I think those are systems, for sure.
You're going to learn a lot as you go through it, but do what you can to become as familiar with the terminology as you can, at very least, and what it is you're getting and what you aren't getting. Because remember, in my mind, reliability is a big one. You want to get a system designed up there that's going to be reliable over time, because it's now yours. Mm-hmm. You're your own utility. It's if something goes sideways, now it's on you.
Well, that's a good point,
and
you also want to be teaching the rest of your community and your board, and so learn as much as you can. That sounds like good advice. Yeah.
You don't have to know all the details about it. You just need to know enough, as you say, that you have a reasonable amount of trust that you can go forward with a person who does know more. And it's like buying anything. I buy a computer, I don't have a clue really, but I trust who I buy it from, and that they'll support me if I have an issue, and that's good enough to a certain extent.
I think your checklist through the process would be a useful tool for people.
Yes, there are a number of approvals, and the solar installers do most of the heavy lifting related to those. But at some point, somebody needs to do a signature, and somebody has to provide a set of keys, and that has to happen reasonably quickly, because in 3 or 4 weeks the snow is going to fly, and it's going to be too cold to get up on the roof. So, depending on when you do your timing of the whole thing, you want to be ready for those milestones when they hit, and you want to be able to react quickly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know when we did ours, I was like at 2 months ahead of what I thought might be the time they'd be getting on it. I consulted with the person that rents out the hall and gave her a heads up to ask her best times too. So, if there was some huge wedding or event where she didn't want it disturbed, like that kind of thing. So, yeah, communication, I guess, too, is...
Yes, and as Warren said, once you get to the part of actually installing it all, really fast, like within a week, likely, depending on the size of your system and how complicated your roof is. But they don't even need a large laydown area, really. Remember that the very first thing that you need is you need to talk to your CRC and get city approval, because it is a physical change to the building. They won't likely have much of an issue with it, but they need to be consulted very first before any of the rest of it happens, right? So remember to get that going, and the city can take a bit of time to get that done. So give yourself as much lead time as you can.
What have you learned from working with community leagues?
It's kind of like
diplomacy is key.
It's kind of like herding cats sometimes.
Sorry, I was going to grab
no, but because it is a volunteer-driven organization, to Kenneth's point, even getting things like keys to the building can be challenging at times, right? I would say that every contractor should be very open about providing proof of workers' compensation coverage, general liability insurance, very basic stuff like that. Even before they really get up on the roof, fall protection plan. Every reputable contractor should have a fall protection plan in place as well. Okay. These very fundamental basic things, which seem self-evident, but not everybody does this stuff, right? It does have to pass an electrical inspection, but the building permit and those types of things have kind of streamlined over the years, and so really it falls down to really an electrical inspection, and to be honest, the electrical inspection is quite quick. It's 10 or 15 minutes, and they are not going to catch everything in that short a time, right? So you do have to really rely on references and that. But from a contractor side, I really like working with the leagues, right? It's a great resource. And Edmonton's very fortunate that we have the Federation as well. The Federation and the leagues do some great stuff in our community. It's really great to see. So, yeah, I like working with the leagues. It's good. But it is honestly, you're working with volunteers, and so it can be hard to get a hold of people. That kind of stuff.
And do you have do these solar installers have access to structural engineers to study is the roof going to support that extra load? And that's part of the price,
I would say. And if it's something that, you're not going to catch everything on let's say during the quoting period necessarily, because you have to take out ceiling tiles and stuff like that. But they should be able to identify any seriously structural stuff and then come back to the board. And it could be a showstopper for some, or you may have to shift the location and stuff like that to do work around on it. Okay, but it can be most good contractors can estimate a job fairly good, and they'll know when there's concerns about the structure, right? And so, yeah, it's hard to say. Like Rio Terrace had this funny kind of truss system that was popular for a few years, and you even saw it in hospitals and stuff, so lots of government buildings and stuff, but it's kind of a questionable structural element at the moment, so, or today I should say, but it was all over the place at one time, and it was unique to Alberta. It was somebody's local invention here, and it just took off, and but it's just an indication of that. You open up the roof and it's like, oh, surprise, but yeah, and that's not so atypical on construction in general.
I just got a letter from the city of Edmonton
Hawk and go to the Commonwealth Stadium to swim. They shut it down for renovations, but now, and it was supposed to open in September. Now they found that there's a drop ceiling, and it's a saltwater pool.
Right.
The ties that hold the drop
corroding?
ceiling from the main ceiling have corroded, and they have to replace that. Otherwise, you're going to have
The whole ceiling
stuff like
collapse.
this
Yeah.
falling down on the lifeguards and the. So it's going to be closed for another till Christmas.
Wow.
Yeah, you never know what happens.
That brings up another good point is one of the reasons we did our solar installation when we did it was because the year before we had just finished putting new roofing on.
Yeah.
So the roofing now has a chance to last as long as the solar array will within a reasonable time period, right? You don't want to have old shingles underneath there necessarily because you're going to have to yank it to deal with the shingles. And remember to contact your insurance company, right, to let them know that you're going to be doing this, right, because you're going to be adding to the, the capital value of the building.
I don't think anybody caught that on the slide, but North Glenora did have their system stolen last year. And
The solar panels.
Solar panels. They didn't take everything. They just took the modules and the inverters. So, but they left the racking behind and everything. So it can happen, and it was just an insurance claim, and the insurance paid for it. But it's something. It shouldn't affect your premium, but it increases the value of your building. So you should have it noted on your insurance, especially if you have a fire and the place burns down. Then it becomes part of the replacement of it.
Oh yeah. One other thing: make sure you apply for way more funding than you need, right, to cover for the possibility that you don't get them all. Right? Because you can always manage that after the fact, but if you don't have enough up front.
And we'll talk about funding next week.